Thank you, everybody, for coming to the Aaron Torres Podcast YouTube page. If you could do me a quick favor, see that little subscribe button at the bottom of your screen? Go ahead, click that subscribe button. Really does help our channel grow, our audience grow, and I really do appreciate it more than you know. So click that subscribe button. Appreciate your support. Now, here's the video that you came here for. The UConn Huskies, okay? So here's the bottom line. UConn, as I'm recording here now, it's worth noting, of course, that it is Tuesday night. UConn is playing in the 7th place game in the Maui Invitational this week after losing to Memphis on Monday and then a stunner to Colorado on Tuesday. But here's the bottom line. What most of you care about is Dan Hurley. What most of you care about is him yelling and screaming at the refs. So we'll discuss that first, and then we'll get into UConn's actual basketball problems. By the way, forgive me, I am going to steal a swig of water. My throat is on fire because I am screaming over a loudspeaker here in a hockey arena. So give me a second here. All right, I'm back. Good to be back. All right, so listen, recording Tuesday night. UConn will play again Wednesday in the 7th place game. And as a UConn fan, the most interesting thing to me is that UConn, which had won 17 straight games coming into the Maui Invitational, is in the 7th place game. Here's the thing, though. Most of you care about Dan Hurley. I actually had no idea how controversial Dan Hurley is and how angry people got about Dan Hurley, his sideline antics, and are they too much? And we saw it on display in the Memphis game on Monday. So I know it's Tuesday night. Many of you will listen on Wednesday. And I know that the story's a couple days old, but so many of you hit me up, I think we got to talk about it, okay? So for people who missed it, and I don't think you did if you're watching this show, if you missed it, UConn's playing Memphis. Kind of a miracle they were in overtime because they were not very good for the first part of that game, okay? And in that game, it's in overtime. It is tied at 92-92. Liam McNeely, the freshman star who we talked about so much on this channel over the course of the spring when he was being recruited, he drives the lane, goes up for a shot. Or excuse me, I forget who shot it, but he goes up for a rebound, grabs the rebound, puts it back up, whistle called. Everybody in the arena thinks that Liam McNeely is fouled. He's going to the line to take 2 foul shots. Remember, 92-92, tie game in overtime. What ends up happening? No, the whistle is an offensive foul. It is on Liam McNeely. It is on UConn, and it's going the other way. Dan Hurley is irate. Dan Hurley is not happy. And, oh, by the way, they're doing introductions here. If they do the national anthem, I might have to stop here for half a second. But Dan Hurley is irate. Dan Hurley is not happy. And the reason that I bring it up is because he's screaming at the ref and he gets a technical. And what was an offensive foul on UConn became a technical. It became a 4-point possession for Memphis. Memphis goes up 96-92, and Memphis ends up winning the game. And so after the game, obviously the conversation is, did Dan Hurley cost his team a win? But then more importantly, Dan Hurley had a lot to say about the refs. So before I get to my take, let me first have producer Matt. I know the video is probably a day or two old. I'm sure you've heard it by now. But producer Matt, play Dan Hurley talking about the refs after the game.
What went on out there in the game? That over the back call at that point of the game, there was no attempt to block out. There was a player on Memphis that made a half-ass effort to rebound that basketball, and Liam McNeely high-pointed that rebound. For that call to be made at that point of the game was a complete joke, all right? And then for me, I don't know what happened. I might have lost my balance by the absurdity of the call, or maybe I tripped. But if I made that call at that point, I would have ignored the fact that I was on my back. If I made that call, I would have ignored that. I would have ignored that. That was obviously a major. How you could call that while that game was going on, the way that game was going on, is just beyond me. But I know, I've never seen the one ref before. I didn't even know he was a college ref. And then, I'm familiar with the other two, so I'm not surprised.
So that was Dan Hurley after Monday's game, okay? And obviously that commentary lit up the internet. Everybody's fired up. Did he cross a line? Is it fair? Is it not? All of that good stuff. Well, I bring it up to say this. In life, a couple things are true. And as I always say, there are things that seem counter to each other that absolutely can be true. There is no time and there is no place to get a technical in a tie game in overtime when your team is battling to win. I also think if you hate Dan Hurley for who he is, you're kind of an idiot, because that fire in his belly is what makes Dan Hurley, the coach who has won back-to-back national championships. Now, listen, I, of course, as 99% of you know, I'm a UConn alum. I grew up on Jim Calhoun basketball. And I will readily admit, okay, so I'm a UConn alum. And I think whenever I comment on UConn, everybody, if it's too negative, people say, oh, you're not a real UConn person, whatever. But if it's too positive, oh, you're a UConn homer. So let me get this out of the way. Dan Hurley, first of all, let me say this. I actually don't think the foul call was like the worst call that I've ever seen. Now, I don't think it was the best call either. And I think it was compounded by the fact, by the way, on Tuesday against Colorado, there was another controversial over the back that went against UConn. This time, UConn was the team boxing out, and it was called a defensive foul, but that's another conversation for another day. But listen, as a UConn fan, I can tell you, I don't think it was the worst foul call that I've ever seen. I would have preferred that the refs held their whistle. And I will also say, as a UConn fan, that Dan Hurley just can't get a technical. He just can't do that. You have to be under control. Whoever's on the bench has to pull him away. You cannot let that happen. At the same time, though, let me say this. I saw a ton on social media on Monday into Tuesday of, I'm so glad that guy's not my coach, and he's an embarrassment to the game, and this, that, the other thing. Well, first of all, there's literally maybe 2 programs in America that would not trade their coach for Dan Hurley right now? I'm sorry. Ask Duke fans about John Shire after tonight. Would you love to have Dan Hurley? I think you would. Whoever. There's under 5. I can count on one hand. If you're telling me you would never want Dan Hurley as your head coach, I can count on one hand the number of schools that would not trade their coach for Dan Hurley. So stop telling me that he's an embarrassment, he's a clown, you would never want him to be your coach, whatever. Stop it. You would be privileged. You would be privileged to have Dan Hurley as your head coach, okay? So I don't want to hear that part, okay? By the way, second game has started behind me. Again, you can hear the players calling out plays on the court. Anyway, neither here nor there, okay? Bottom line, don't tell me you don't want him as your head coach, but here's the other thing, and this is important. Producer Matt, you can go ahead and clip this off, but I also want you to put up the tweet, okay? Is that Dan Hurley is who he is, and Dan Hurley is a successful coach, okay? But at the same time, this is what matters. For everybody saying, oh, we wouldn't want him as our head coach, that's nonsense. But here's the other thing. What makes Dan Hurley makes him not only a great basketball coach, but the perfect coach for UConn. I tweeted this out on Tuesday morning, and boy, oh boy, did I get some pushback. By the way, I was driving to Vegas right before I tweeted it out. Did not expect the pushback that I ended up getting, okay? But I tweeted this out. I tweeted out a video of the sound, and I said, this is a perfect example of why Dan Hurley wouldn't have worked at Kentucky. Because, by the way, the video was a video of Mark Pope versus Dan Hurley. And it says why he would not have worked out at Kentucky, not he was ever getting the Kentucky job. Hurley is perfect for UConn and Connecticut. Feisty, chip on his shoulder, us against the world. His fans love him because he is us. If you're not from Connecticut, you can't understand. And so I put that out. That was really for UConn fans, and that obviously it did not get taken that way by so many others. So first of all, people from Connecticut are soft. Okay, whatever. If that's how you feel, listen, I'm not here to argue with you. I could throw out some stats. I could throw out some this. I could throw out some that. Google some stuff about Bridgeport, Connecticut. Google some stuff about New Haven. Google some stuff about Waterbury. That's neither here nor there. We got some, but it's not just about that. It is about the fact that people from Connecticut, I am here to tell you, we got a chip on our shoulder, okay? We have a chip on our shoulder, and I am here to tell you that Dan Hurley perfectly encapsulates Connecticut and perfectly encapsulates UConn. He's Northeast. He's tough. He's rough around the exterior. He drops too many F-bombs. He is Connecticut. For people who are not familiar with Connecticut, I'm just going to say it. It's halfway between New York. It's halfway between Boston. We get crapped on. Joe Rogan the other day said, oh, Connecticut's just a highway to get to New York City. Screw you, Joe Rogan, okay? I don't want to hear it. But the bottom line is that if you're not from Connecticut, you don't understand. And so to me, I saw a lot of someday it's going to catch up with him. Maybe. I mean, I don't know. Maybe he'll be the next Woody Hayes. But to me, one, he's actually gotten the anger much more under control the last couple of years. But two, and I think this is the more important part. And by the way, I want to be clear. I don't speak for everybody from Connecticut, whatever. I know somebody from Connecticut's going to be like, don't talk about my state. I'm just here to tell you. People from Connecticut have a chip on their shoulder. People from Connecticut, don't like getting pushed around. People from Connecticut, whatever. And Dan Hurley perfectly encapsulates that, okay? And so I solely bring it up to say that I think that attitude is two things. One, it's what makes Dan Hurley. But then also I'm going to take it a step further. It's not only what makes Dan Hurley, it's what makes his fan base adore him because he's one of us. He's like us. He's got a chip on his shoulder. He doesn't let people push him around, and he wasn't going to let those refs push him around. Now, again, I wish he hadn't gotten the tech. But listen, if the alternative is I have a softie as a head coach that didn't just win 2 national championships, then I'm trading a tech in Maui for what I've seen the last 2 Marches when UConn's won 12 straight NCAA tournament games by double figures, okay? So listen, there's nothing else to say about the Dan Hurley stuff. You're allowed to disagree. If you would never want him as your coach, that's fine. Congrats on going to the NIT. Congrats on not winning national championships. Dan Hurley, right now, there's 3 active coaches with 2 national titles, Rick Pitino, Bill Self, and Dan Hurley.